The Prime Minister has pinned the early days of his premiership on getting Brexit done, a mantra he recounted numerous times on the campaign trail and subsequently chanted by Conservative MPs in the Commons yesterday. Mr Johnson is planning to make the deadline on the second phase of EU negotiations legally binding, but can an EU trade deal be secured by this time next year? Joining me are a panel of EU and policy experts. Georgina Wright is from the Institute for Government, Ali Renison from the Institute of Directors, and Victoria Hewson from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Welcome to you all. And now, Ali Renison, I mean, we did have yesterday a plunge in sterling when the government said that it was going to get everything completed inside a year. There wouldn't be another extension period. Why was that?
Well, because I think people are looking at this as a potential prospect of a different type of no deal next year. You look at the constraints that are put on and you think, well, is something going to give? Is it that we're not going to have an agreement in place by the end of next year? Is it that we are going to agree to all EU concessions? I think that's probably unlikely. Is it that we're not going to be very ambitious in what we're trying to do? But I think what the markets probably read from that most was the prospect of another type of no deal looming next year was potentially in the fore.
Because, I mean, the argument being put forward by the government is that actually they're now in the driving seat. They've told the EU what the timetable is, therefore the EU will have to come to heel.
Well, I think that's would be an ambitious way of looking at it. I think it's fair to say, though, that putting the non-extension into law is very much a signalling move. As a lawyer, I can say it's not good. It's not good lawmaking, but it's a strong signal. Not so much actually to the domestic.
Why is it not good lawmaking?
Because it's kind of slightly meaningless from a legal perspective. Because if the Prime Minister, in the end, come the end of June, wanted to change his mind, he has enough of a majority to repeal that law and proceed with an extension. But what it does is it puts an obstacle in the way, and it sends a message to the EU that Boris Johnson wasn't pretending when he was talking about getting Brexit done. He really meant it, and that's a strong signal to the EU side that they cannot expect him to row back towards a soft Brexit.
I mean, Georgina, on past precedent, how much could you get done in 12 months or really 6 months until you have to decide whether you're going to extend?
Well, that's the key question, isn't it? I was in Brussels 2 weeks ago, and no one in Brussels thinks that a deal can be negotiated, reached and passed within 11 months, at least not a deal that was foreseen in the political declaration. So there are several options, and I think actually the EU do take the Prime Minister's word very seriously. Some of them think, oh, he might pivot to a softer form of Brexit, which would allow, a comprehensive, detailed deal where basically the UK sort of moves a lot.
I mean, I have to say that Michael Gove told me yesterday, he says the political declaration accepted by both sides does say they were going to sort it out inside a year. Is that right? Yeah,
but it also included the prospect and the possibility of an extension if talks couldn't be wrapped up in time. And the reason is I think on the EU side particularly, it's not just a matter of negotiation, it's also a matter of passing that deal. And actually, depending on the kind of deal, it's not just EU governments who have to say yes, it's also the European Parliament and possibly even national and regional parliaments. And it's just a very big year for the EU. So they're trying to weigh up, OK, what kind of deal do we want and can it be reached in time?
I think you also have to remember about who is this agreement going to affect? Who's going to have to use it? The end users, mostly, that's business. And I think what we're certainly concerned about is you can argue backwards and forwards about how long it takes to actually do the deal, how long it takes to ratify it on both sides, but how much time are you actually leaving for people who are going to have to adjust to it to adjust? You can't expect businesses without having seen the detail of what that change is going to be, and it's probably going to be fairly bespoke. And the more bespoke you get, the harder it is to plan for it.
But the other argument that's being put is we are already in alignment.
Yeah.
So basically, you can just shut off sections and say, right, well, we're not going to change that, we're not going to change that.
I think,
and that makes it
I think that area is sometimes over-relied on people, and so others refuse to countenance that it makes negotiations any easier at all. It gets you to a point, but the issue is that if you're trying to have what a lot of people talk about, the prospect of managed divergence, that requires potentially new institutions to be set up. It's pretty unprecedented, and so the more bespoke you get, the more time, generally speaking, you leave to create that.
I would just sort of counter that slightly by saying the referendum, by the time the end of the transition period happens, the referendum will have happened over 4 years ago. Businesses have had an awful lot of time to prepare for what was always stated to be the intention on leaving the customs union, leaving the single market. We've had an awful lot of work done towards preparing for no deal. And a lot of the systems and processes that you have for no deal are actually very similar to what you have if you have a free trade agreement. So the idea of leaving a customs union, you require customs declarations, you require conformity assessments. That's all known. And that's the same whether you have no deal, which businesses have been actively preparing for the past several years, and if you have a free trade agreement. So actually, a lot of the work has been done.
But I don't agree with that at all in respective businesses, because if you look at the no-deal preparations, some of them were ranging from looking at whether you're going to have a hard border on the island of Ireland, whether we were going to have tariffs, just to look at tariffs alone, the idea of whether you have tariffs or not, how do you plan for something like that? How do you plan for knowing whether you're going to have, we won't go into the technical detail of it, rules of origin for tariffs now? And I think the biggest difference for this agreement going forward is what's going to happen for trade within the UK, Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Because of the revised deal that the Prime Minister brought back, there are a lot of changes in there for trade potentially between the rest of the UK, and that requires a lot of implementation.
But the Prime Minister said there's just not going to be a border in the Irish Sea.
But the devil's in the detail, right? You can have an aspiration, you can have a vision of what you'd like, and certainly the political declaration kind of highlights what that could look like, but then it's all the detail, it's what you need, it's the new infrastructure, it's that negotiation about how do we agree the minute detail, and do we have time? And this, I think, is the real concern for the EU. They say, OK, if the Prime Minister is firm that he absolutely does not want to extend that period of talks, fine, but what does a basic trade agreement look like? What do you include in it? And can EU countries amongst themselves agree what should be in that deal? Because they all have different interests when it comes to the UK.
But I think that was partly why the Prime Minister's strong message about not accepting an extension, in a way, could be useful for the EU side, because it will concentrate the 27 on coming up with a unified position, in the same way that the quite tight timetable under the Article 50 process very much helped them to come to their negotiating guidelines in the Council.
Do you not find it strange, though, that when you look at what was in the Conservative manifesto that is obviously going to influence the direction of travel of this government, it was going to leave 3 years for other negotiations with other countries, but refused to countenance the possibility that you might need a bit longer than a year for an unprecedented set of negotiations with the closest market? I thought that was a bit of a sort of a strange sort of smashing up against two different areas.
Well, but they're different contexts, though, aren't they? Because with negotiations with the rest of the world, it almost doesn't matter terribly much if they do roll on, and that's a normal feature of negotiating free trade agreements. With the EU one, we do have a deadline, and the deadline is there for a good reason, and the deadline focuses minds, as we saw with the previous two iterations of the withdrawal agreement being agreed in very short timeframes. They managed to agree a whole customs union in a matter of weeks for the Theresa May deal, and then they managed to unravel a whole customs union and establish a whole unprecedented solution for Northern Ireland in the second iteration.
I agree with you, and I think, but the difference is that this is a different kind of negotiation than on withdrawal. When it comes to a trade, and it's not just trade, it's about security as well, you have many more EU voices adding to the mix.
It's going to be complicated. Thank you all very much indeed.